Right, so welcome to April's. We should have done this on April 1st, it would have been so much better. The April MonoGame open hours. It looks like we're going to be pretty light. I think Vic, you're probably going to be taking stage for most of this, since my colleagues in arms are around, or not around, as the case may be. Um, April's been a very quiet month, mainly because everyone's been away or visiting or going on holiday and going to sunny places, even though it was cold. So not too much going on apart from the fact that we got the 3.8.3 release out, and we're now rapidly scrambling to try and get an updated sort of 3.8.1. I want to say update release that we've left Hotfix near, but it's not really a Hotfix release because as part of the cadence that we promised for the formation of the foundation, we're going to start releasing things faster. Faster can sometimes introduce issues. So what we're also trying to do now is get the actual preview release schedule out so we can test more releases before they hit out. The thing that's caused the most of the issues is that for whatever reason, one of the new solutions that not new solutions, but old solutions that we re-added, which is to bring back the validation for code comparity for consoles, what's called the console check, which tests every release to make sure the fact we're not trying to use language features which are not supported on other platforms, which can cause problems. Was brought back, but for some bizarre reason that tried to package itself, and because NuGet didn't know what that was, all of our automation for publishing releases sort of failed, and when we release things manually, it's kind of messed up some of the numbering, which caused some other issues. There was a few other little bugs and things that are sort of crept in, which have mostly been addressed now. So those who are doing supporting desktop platforms and supporting iOS and others, they were all working fine. There was a minor issue with Android. There's now a noted issue on publishing release with iOS. But all of those things have been already rapidly fixed, and the team have jumped on them and got ahead of the game. And we're just ironing out the last few fixes for an update release as part of our sort of accelerated release cadence. And we're going to attempt to do the first preview release for that with the new automation and workflows ahead of time to try and get those up to date. DirectX 12 is nearing completion now. Tom assures us that he's just doing the last few bits and checks. The biggest bugbear at the moment is around audio. Having audio that works across everywhere is apparently extremely hard. So we're working to make sure there's a balanced approach of a basic option that works, and then for anyone who wants to go beyond that, they can implement their own solution. The kind of recommended way of doing it, especially because thinking my consoles, is to actually use F Audio. They have a fairly decent free tier, and you don't have to start paying them in anything until you get beyond a certain tier of that. And we have already talked about actually providing rigid guidance and documentation about how you can do and how you can adopt that quickly and easily. So from an update perspective, that's pretty much all we've got to say for this month. It's fairly light. We're working very hard on the scenes to try and iron out anything that was highlighted or raised regarding the 3.8.3 release. There's a lot of bug fixes in there, a lot of changes. And again, we're trying to move faster. Everyone's working hard behind the scenes to ensure that fixes get done, changes get merged, and as we go faster, things are going to be a little bit rocky at the beginning, probably, but we're working on making sure the fact that all the releases and everything are going faster and getting over. So, I'm losing screens now, bear with me. So, Vic, if I may then hand the stage over to you. You've got a revisit on Go. There's some new things you want to do, and I don't know whether you're going to announce your sneaky little introduction to other areas of MonoGame. MonoGame's being infiltrated in a good way, because it's showing goods and standards. And you are muted, Vic, by the way.
Yep. Just making sure you guys can hear me okay. And I will kick off a screen share.
Yep, I shall
So,
stop my screen so you may take over.
alrighty. And go live.
There we go.
Okay.
And I'm
All right.
going to spotlight you so I can see. Right. So I shall mute myself unless you need me, and then so over to you.
Fantastic. All right, let's get started. So yeah, let me kick off. I have some slides. I'm going to do that as companions to what we're going to talk about. All right. So yeah, thanks for having me. It's been about 3 months since I did our previous presentation, and the previous presentation was really focused on the GUM tool, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But this presentation is focused purely on doing everything in code. So code only GUM. We will mention the tool in passing, but this is for the many of you who prefer to do things in Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio or Writer or whatever, and not have to open up any kind of tool, not worry about file loading. Before I get started, first I just want to thank Aristotle for helping me with this presentation. Also, I want to thank Caltenril, who I don't think is in the chat right now. I don't see him, but he's been helping me a ton over the past few months. So as I talk through this presentation, I may use the word we, and I'm referring to all of the people who've helped me with this and all of the code changes that have gone into the past few months. So thanks to everyone. Yeah, let's get started. So a quick review for those of you who aren't familiar. When we use the word GUM, we're really talking about a variety of different things. There's a whole layout tool, which I talked about previously in January, which again, I'm not going to be talking about much in this presentation. There's what we call the forms framework, and this is what we are going to be talking about today. And this is buttons, text boxes, all the things that you're probably used to having in a typical C# front end like WPF, Avalonia, Maui, and so on. In fact, the syntax, a lot of the syntax for working with these forms controls is copied off of WPF. And since Avalonia is kind of a copy of WPF, if you've used either of those, you're going to feel right at home using forms. Everything is very similar. And then, of course, GUM also can refer to the screen space layout engine, which is at the base of what we're going to be showing today. But again, it's worth repeating that if you're interested in just the layout engine and not all of the things above it, you can integrate that into your project with a single NuGet package as well. So you can build your own UI without having to worry about the complexities of wrapping and stacking and sizing and responsive design and all of the things that you would have to do for a full UI engine. And finally, of course, everything is open source. You can do pretty much anything you want with anything I talk about today, anything I've talked about in the past. Yeah, so let's get started. So GUM can be used in code, and this is actually one of the first questions that we get when we talk to people in the MonoGame community. In fact, a lot of people have repeated the same sentiment that, yeah, GUM is cool, the tool is interesting, but that's not how I want to develop my game. I want to do everything just with code. And, that was kind of an eye-opening experience for me because I'm like, well, you can do this, but so many people don't realize it. And so for the past, I'd say, month or so, we've been focused on making that way smoother, writing tons of documentation to show how it's done. So now you can just pop open your IDE and write code, and right away you can get some UI, and I'll be showing that. So you get common controls, button, text box, list box. There's a lot, and we're always adding more. So pretty much anything you would expect from another framework, you can get from GUM. And if we don't have it, I mentioned this before, GUM is super duper active. We have releases many times a month. We have a super active Discord and issues on GitHub, and I'm on pretty much 7 days a week. So you can always DM me or ping me in the MonoGame Discord. So you can get feedback real quick, or you can get help real quick. And a lot of times if you need new features, we can add them. So GUM is stylable. We'll be showing how to style GUM in this presentation. It's extensible. You can create your own controls and reuse those. It has full MVVM support, which is really cool if you're familiar with that. If you're not, no big deal, but you can use that and lots more. So instead of just talking about it, let's do the risky thing and actually show some code. Actually, before I get into the code, I'm going to paste something in the chat right now. I should have done this earlier. I apologize. For those of you who are interested, I'm going to be pasting a few links here. And the very first one is actually a GitHub project that you can download right now. It is the exact same project that I'm going to be using for this presentation. Oh man, I'm sorry for all the embeds popping up. Let me remove those. But anyway, yeah, so you can just download the source, and like I said, it's the exact same project I'm doing right now, and all of the parts that I'm going to be pulling out and putting in are in their own dedicated text file, separated by these big comment lines. So again, you can put pieces in, see how they work, play around with it. I hope you guys try it out. All right, so now let's actually get into the code. Okay, so first thing I want to show you is this is a very simple MonoGame project, probably very similar to what you're used to, with the exception that we have this property right here. And actually, I'll zoom in a little bit. I don't know if everyone can see this clearly, so I'll just zoom just to be safe. There's really, once you have this property defined, there's only 3 lines of code that you need. There's an initialize, an update, and a draw. And that's it. Once you have this set up, GUM is fully functional. Of course, you're not going to see anything. It's just going to be your regular cornflower blue. But you can see once you have this, you can put in some very basic controls. So I'll just copy my first block of text here. And I'm creating a panel. So I'll start the code compiling while I talk about it. So a panel is just basically a container for other UI elements. And it's usually a good idea to put a panel as your first object. It can be a stack panel, which will stack things top to bottom, left to right. Or you can have a normal panel, which will just let you place things around using absolute coordinates. Usually I recommend stack panels just because it makes it real easy. And then you can see all you have to do is create a control, in this case a button, and then add the control to the panel. And if I mouse over right now, you'll see that the button does highlight. It's kind of faint, but you can kind of see it. And then if I click on the button, you'll see that it also darkens. So just by doing this, I have fully functional UI. Like there's nothing else I have to do to get this to work. Now, of course, I'll probably have to put some logic in to make it work with how I want it to work in my game. For instance, maybe I want to respond to the button being clicked. So in this case, put a little bit of extra code in here. All I'm doing now is I'm moving the stack panel to the center of the screen and putting some spacing between each items. Again, most of this, at least as far as spacing is concerned, these are all WPF properties. So again, if you're familiar with that, you'll recognize this. And then for my buttons, I'm just setting some initial text on it. And then when I click, oh, I'm sorry, slow down. Please increase text size. Thank you for the feedback. I appreciate that. I will slow down, and I will increase the text size. I hope that's good. Give me a thumbs up if that looks good for you. So anyway, now we have an event that I can add here. And this is just a standard event handler. So it has a sender and then event args, which I'm not using in this particular case. But if I run this code now, you'll see that I have 10 buttons because that's what I have in my loop right here. And each one has its own independent clicking. So if I click on the first one, you'll see that it changed. And this is the date and time where I am right now. And each button just responds to a click. Pretty easy. Of course, in a real game, you might not do something like this. You would navigate to the next screen or whatever you would want to do in response to a button. So this shows you, again, that you do have fully functional controls, but so far we've only looked at the button class. And so we want to show that there's actually quite a few types of controls that you can use in GUM. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. The next thing I want to talk about is when we run this code, the cursor is actually controlled by the mouse, right? I have a mouse here. And then also, I don't have a touch screen on this particular monitor, but if you were to have a touch screen, it would automatically work with touch events. So you could tap on the buttons and they would work. But beyond that, you also have built-in code or built-in support for keyboard and gamepads. And so these two properties right here are the default keyboard and the default gamepads that come right out of the box for MonoGame, or I'm sorry, for GUM. and all you have to do is notify the GUM system, or particularly the framework element, which is the base class for button and all other controls, that you're interested in using these particular gamepads and these keyboards. Now, it might seem weird that I'm saying these keyboards. In this case, this is a list, and of course you can add and remove from the list, but since this is an interface, you could actually create your own virtual keyboards that you could add to the list or remove to the list, and you can that's kind of an advanced scenario. Usually you would just have this one keyboard, but it's there as an option. For gamepads, it makes sense because you might say, oh, only player 1 has joined, and so I only want player 1 to be able to control the UI, or maybe I want all players to control. So in this case, I have all gamepads being controlled, and everything else is the same with the exception of this line of code right here. Is focused. And in this case, I'm giving the button focus because to interact with a UI element, with the keyboard, or with the gamepad, it has to first have focus. And if you don't give anything focus, then the keyboard and gamepad won't do anything. So those are really the only 2 additional lines of code that I've added here. And so if I run the game, you'll notice that the very top button now, since it's index 0 right here, has focus. It has this white square around it. And if I push enter on the keyboard, I'll try to push it loud so you can hear, you can see that it's responding to input. And I can tab through the buttons. So I'm just pushing the tab key, pushing enter to select different buttons. And I can shift tab to go back. This is your typical reverse tabbing navigation. Also, I have a gamepad here. Hope that shows up okay. And so if I push up and down on the D-pad, you'll notice I'm also moving between these. Pushing A will automatically select the button. And then you can also use the analog stick for navigation. It's D-pad or analog stick. Either one will work. Yeah, so again, you get this for free out of the box, which is really cool. You don't have to worry about implementing that all yourself. Now, this isn't just, and I guess maybe this isn't obvious, you can also use all of them at once, right? So I can still click and I can still use gamepad, like they're both doing their thing. So the controls, all of the forms controls in GUM support gamepads and keyboards. So it's not just buttons. So if I paste some more code here, and I'm not going to necessarily go through all of this because there's a ton of code here. But what I want to point out here is that you'll notice that I'm mixing a lot of different types of controls. I have labels, text boxes, combo boxes, check boxes, sliders, and a button at the end. So if I run this, you'll see that I have not super complicated, but a little bit more UI here. And as you would expect, everything does work with the mouse, just like normal. Right, this full screen checkbox isn't actually wired up, so it's not making this full screen, but that's not the point of the video. So you can see I'm doing all kinds of things here to show that I can interact with the mouse. And of course, this is a keyboard, or a text box. How cool is that? It even scrolls. All right. Now, if I push tab at this point, what will happen is instead of my text box having focus, I can tab down to this combo box, and I can now use keyboard to select from those. Again, you can see everything is fully functional with the keyboard, and of course, gamepad. Probably no surprise, but I can move through these things as well. Of course, the gamepad can't put in text, unfortunately, at least not on the PC. So that's something that you'd have to just use a physical keyboard for. But all right, so that's the end of the first part, the first part of the presentation. And that's just to show you the basic controls, how easy it is to get this working in your project. And literally, this you just drop your NuGet package in, and it will work in any project that you have. And this has been tested on platforms other than PC. It works on mobile, for instance, and even if you're using KNI or FNA, it'll work there, including on web. So you have a lot of platform support, which is pretty cool. So I want to dive into styling a little bit. This is another big area where we get questions, and it's also a really important area because I think one of the first things that people think about when they're looking at UI is they say, well, why not just use IMG UI, because that's really popular. It's used in a lot of games. And no question, it's awesome, and I'm not trying to discourage you from using that. But one of the downsides with IMG UI is that you are limited in your styling. At least that's how I understand it, is that the styling is not quite as flexible as you would want it to be for a final game. Whereas here we can do all of our styling in code. And when we do our styling, we can apply styling essentially on the entire control. For example, we could just say, I always want my text to be twice as big on this label. Or you can apply your styling what we call per state. And this just basically means, okay, if my button is pressed, I want it to look like this. If my button is hovered over with the mouse or the cursor, I want it to look like this. If my button is disabled, I want it to look like this. And so you can do both types of styling. I'll show you how to do both. And here on the right side, you can see there's just some examples of stylings that I just threw together real quick. I mean, it's programmer art, so it doesn't look great, but you can see there's quite a bit of flexibility there. The last point that I want to make is that controls have minimal requirements. And what I mean by that is that the buttons that we've been working with so far have essentially three parts. They have the text, they have the background, and then they have that white rectangle around the edges that shows up when the button is in focus. Now that happens to be how the default buttons are built, but that's not required. If you want to make a button that doesn't have text, you can totally do that. If you want to have a button that uses a 9 slice instead of a solid color, you can do that. If you want to have a single sprite with just everything baked into it, you're free to do that as well. If you want it to be invisible, whatever you want. There's really no limitation. There's minor things that we'll talk about that you have to have so that your UI can actually function. But for the most part, you can build your UI however you want. All right, so we're going to get back into the demos, and I will show you how to do some styling. And let's get the next block of code up. All right, actually, before I begin the styling, I'm just going to go back essentially to a simple starting point where I just have a regular button, right? It's just going to say start game, nothing special about it, and it's using the default font here. So this is just this white, I think it's Arial, but I'm not certain. That's just the default font. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to just modify the text on the button. So we're going to take this label inside of the text, or inside of the button, and I'm going to show you how to make modifications to that. Now the button is actually constructed of what we call visuals. And so, as I mentioned before, the button has 3 visuals, and technically it actually has 4 visuals, because the root visual is just the container that defines the size of the button, and then within that container we do have the 3 parts: the background, the text, and then the white outline. Now, since anything can exist inside a button, anything can exist inside of any control, there's no way for the button class to say, yeah, here's your text instance that you're working with, or here's your background that you're working with. Because there might not even be a background, and if there is, it could be of any type, it could be named anything. There's really no way to know for sure exactly what that is. So there's a few ways when you're interacting with these controls to find out what visuals you have available. Well, the first here is you can just ask it for a visual based on the type. And so if you happen to know that this button has a text object inside of it, you can use the type text runtime to get access to that. And all of the visuals have the word runtime appended at the end. It's just something you get used to. So there's text runtime, sprite runtime, 9 slice runtime, colored rectangle runtime, and so on. Now, if you want to know exactly what you're working with, of course, you can always put a breakpoint. And I'll do this real quick just to show you. And if I just add button.visual.children, and I look in here, you'll see these are the 3 children inside of my visual, which is the root object. And if you look in here, you can see I have 3 objects. This right here just displays its name: text instance, button background, focused indicator. Hopefully that name, communicates something to you so you know what it means. And of course the types are right here. In this case, I'm grabbing a text runtime. I can see that I have a text runtime, so this should be a valid call, right? I should get something back. And once I have access to that object just by calling get visual, this right here you can modify in any way that you want. So in this case, I'm saying use a custom font, and I want this to be my font file that I'm using. So you can see I have this font right here. Whoops, every time I do that, I'm surprised that the FNT file eats up my editor. But you can see that these FNT files are just the standard FNT files that are output by Bitmap Font Generator. So if you've used that before, then you might know how to work with this. You can also generate these using the GUM tool. And also, I think there's a libgdx library that can generate fonts as well. Plus, you can modify them by hand if you want. It's all text readable. And then the PNG itself is just, I think this will show up okay. It's just a packed set of characters. The FNT file is essentially your atlas into these characters so that you can type out each letter individually. And so here I'm just assigning that font. And notice here that this is actually going to be loading the file. Internally, GUM does have a caching system. And it will cooperate with MonoGame's content pipeline, and it will cooperate with MonoGame's content manager as well. So if you don't want to use GUM's loading system, or you've done your own atlasing, you're managing your own content your own way, that's totally okay. Every single call that I'll be showing here has an equivalent version where you can just feed it the direct textures or whatever it is that you're loading from files. So you don't have to rely on GUM's loading system. I'm just doing it because it's convenient and it's short, so I'll show it off here. So, oops, I actually shouldn't have stopped, just need to take the breakpoint out. So now if I run it again, you'll notice that the text on this is twice as big, right? You can see I have a scale of 2. Now scale in this case is using rasterized fonts, which means you get the pixelated look, which may or may not be desirable depending on your game. And then of course you can see that the font is this Ravi. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it, but it looks different than it did before. But the button is still behaving like a normal button, right? You can see that I'm still clicking on it, I'm still getting those highlights and so on. And if we want to make modifications to the button in response to events like clicking, like hovering, and so on, what we need to do is, instead of just modifying the visual directly, we need to do so, but we do it per state. So I need to say, okay, in the highlighted state, I want it to look like this. In the hover state, I want it to look like this. In the normal state, which we call the enabled state, I want it to look like this. So that's what we're going to do here in this code right here. As far as the button itself, no different than before, but now I'm grabbing the background. And if you remember earlier when we were looking at the watch window, I had a colored rectangle runtime, which is the background. And now I just have to grab the states based off of the standard naming that's part of GUM. Now this is where you are required to do things a certain way, because if you think about it, internally the button has to do something when you click on it or when you hover over it. And if it doesn't know what is inside of the button, there's no way that it could decide, oh yeah, this is what I should be changing in this particular, when I'm hovering or whatever. And so here we're saying, when you're enabled, this is what we're going to be setting right here. We're going to set the background color to red. When you're highlighted, this is what we're going to be setting right here, the background color to pink. And then when you're in a pushed state, this is what we're going to be setting right here. We're going to be setting it to red. And notice, of course, that before I define the apply function, I first clear the state. And the reason I have to do that is because this is a fully functional button. And before I do any of this code right here, it already has things that it's doing inside of these different states. And I want to just wipe those clean. I don't want to do those. And I want to override it with my own functionality. Since this is a Lambda, of course, you're free to do whatever you want. You can change multiple objects, background text, and so on. You could even do conditional stuff if it makes sense in your game. There's really not a lot of limitations on what you do here. So I'm going to run that. And now, of course, if I hover, you see it turns pink. And on a press, there we go, it goes dark. You can see that difference right there. All right, so the next thing I want to show is of course, here we're instantiating a button, and then we're modifying the button visuals essentially inline, right? If I were to have 1,000 buttons in my game, I would have to put this code in 1,000 different places, or have a common function that I'm calling where I'd say, okay, style it this way or style it this way. That's of course one way that you can do it if you want to consolidate your styling functions into one place, or alternatively, you can create your own components that are reusable. And so that's what I'm going to show you here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to replace all of this inline styling code. I want to get rid of that. And instead, I'm just going to have a simple button, except in this case, I'm instantiating something called a custom button. Now this name is arbitrary. You can name it whatever you want, right? I just happen to call it custom because that's what it is. And now the actual implementation for the button is going to look like this, which I will paste here in my game1 class or game1.cs file. And normally you would probably create a separate function for, or a separate CS file for it, but so let me bounce around a little quicker. So in this case, I'm just creating a custom button that inherits from button. And then as I mentioned before, usually, I should say, controls have a top-level control or a top-level container, which holds all other things. In this case, we have a background, and actually, that's all we have. If you look, the remainder of this function is not creating any more visuals. It's just setting up the states for what happens when you're pressing or releasing or whatever. And so I did this on purpose to show that previously we had texts and colored rectangles and normal rectangles. We got rid of those completely, and we're doing something way different than it was before. We have a 9 slice, which is displaying a texture. These textures, by the way, if you're curious, were pulled from the Kenny UI pack, which is itself free, and you can download it and you can play with these things if you want GUM. So this is just their image. I actually did add a little bit of margin here so that it would squash appropriately, but besides that, there's no modifications to these images at all. And so now I just assign those as the source file. Again, this is just creating a texture 2D. So if you have a texture 2D you want to use instead, you're free to background.texture equals my texture 2D, whatever. If you load this from the content pipeline, you manage it yourself, you're free to do that. So now I just give it a default background, and then all I do is say, okay, well, when you're enabled, this is what you're going to look like. It's going to have some depth to it. In other words, it can be pressed down. That's just their naming. I just didn't change it. And then when you're pushed, we're just going to have the non-depth version, which means the button is squashed down. And you can see, actually, I don't want to do anything special in my highlight state. So all I do is I just clone my enabled state and then just assign the new name and put it in here. And so you can be very explicit by saying, okay, I do want to do all of these things in the states. If you want certain states to behave like other states, you could just clone them. And in the case of highlighting, or I'm sorry, in the case of focus, you can just leave them out completely. And the button will still behave fine. It's just if you happen to set is focus to true, you won't be able to see it. And that's your choice as a developer on what you want to handle. Excuse me. So now if I run this, well, look at that. I have a button. And since I didn't do anything with highlight, it's not like lighting up when I mouse over, but on a press, you can see it's got this neat little 3D effect that when I push it, it gets mashed down. And again, I get all the other functionality that I would get from a button, but I get to control what it looks like, which is really cool. In fact, I can go take it one step further, and let's change the code just slightly so that instead of having a single button, we're going to actually do the same thing that we did at the beginning of the presentation, which is we're going to have 10 buttons which are going to set their date. Now, in this case, I am assigning the text on the button, and which means I need to make sure that I have a text object inside of my button, or else I'm going to have problems. And so I have to make a small modification to my button class to have a text object. So let me just do that real quick. And this is one of those cases where you are forced to do things the quote GUM way. And what I mean specifically by that is you can see that the text object has this reserved text instance name. So again, most of the time you don't have to do anything like that. But since we are going to be using this text property right here, that means the button has to be set up a certain way to support text. And if you forget, you just leave this out or delete this whole thing, you're going to get an exception. It's going to say, hey, you forgot to add something called text instance. So GUM will guide you through its requirements, and all of the other controls that have requirements will also do the same thing. So they'll tell you, oh, you're missing a thumb on your track or on your slider, or you're missing a caret on your text box. So it will guide you through that if you're missing things. So now if I run this, well, there's my buttons. You can see they all show their text, and if I click on each one, well, they're doing that cool little drop. You see that when I click on it? In fact, one of the things that's kind of neat, I guess I should point this out, is if you look at the way we did the states here, you can see that when I'm enabled, I not only am setting my background here, but I'm also setting the Y value to text. So the text is by default centered. I guess I'm kind of bouncing around here. It's a fill doc, which means it's centered, but then it fills its parent. And then when it's pressed, I just drop it 4 pixels. We go down 4 more pixels, and then when it goes back, just right back to where it was. So it gives us this cool effect where the button happens to move along with, or the appearance of the button moving, I guess. In reality, it's just a sprite. All right. So that's it. That's the presentation. Like I said, everything is linked in the chat, and I can paste that again later at the end in case it's scrolled off view. So I can end it now and just leave it open for questions, either for myself or, of course, for Simon or whoever. So, yeah, let's get to that.
Well, we always love questions. Mick, questions are live. Questions are good. As one daft question that comes to mind: why flat Red Bull? Where does this come from?
Where does the name Flat Red Ball come from? Is that the question? Yeah. The flat. Yeah. The name Flat Red Ball actually comes from a long time ago when I was first learning to code. This is even before the XNA days. I finally got a visual on screen, like an image on screen, thanks to some online tutorials or some forum posts at gamedev.net. And I was like, well, I need a graphic. So I went into, for those of you who might remember this, an application called TrueSpace, which was an old 3D application, kind of like, I guess now Blender. It was commercial at the time. So I just went in there and I dropped the sphere in and I rendered that sphere, had a BMP file that I then used for years and years and years as I was demoing and just learning things. And finally, after a few years, I was like, well, I guess I better name this. And I was like, well, why not name it in honor of this flat red ball that's helped me out for all these years? And the name stuck. So there it is. And now we use it, and it's kind of a weird, quirky name, and I think it draws people's attention. Like, what is that? So, it works out for us. Plus, we have the .com, so why not?
I seem to remember was there an engine called Flat Red Bull at one point, or a game?
Yes, so I maintain the GUM tool, which is what I've been focusing on these AMAs, but I also maintain the Flat Red Ball engine. So that's still a thing that I work on, and maybe one day I'll do an AMA on it, but for now I'm focusing more on GUM.
Yes, you probably know some chat that there's a certain Chris fella who's kind of trying to pimp that there's some other content GUM's being used somewhere else.
Yeah, I'll mention this. So Chris has been working on a series of tutorials, which I've actually been calling a book because it's huge. It's at this point like 22 or 23 sections. And at one point he actually spit out a PDF and it was like 400 pages or something like that. It's enormous. Now that's a good thing because if you want to learn everything there is to know about 2D and MonoGame, this is the place to go. And my understanding is this is going to become the official documentation for tutorials for MonoGame. But near the end of the tutorials, we have, at this point, 3 that are discussing UI, and 2 of those are showing you how to use GUM. Some of the same stuff that I've been doing in this presentation is going to end up there. Hopefully it comes out soon. I'm excited. I helped write a little bit of it and helped Chris out with general reviews. So yeah, really excited about that. Simon, did you want me to go through the questions? Or? What's that?
Yeah, no, yeah, it's certainly interesting. Yeah, you're right. The 2D tutorial is the 2D tutorial beginner bounty, and Chris is sort of really setting the stage as the gold standard for how a tutorial should be going forward. And apologies to anyone who picks up a bounty for documentation in the future because he set the bar very, very high, which is great. He's done a lot of work. There's a lot of effort gone into that. It also creates a lot of work for me and for everyone else who's run to review it, to fix corrections and typos and point out things which are not right or where more explanations is needed. In fact, one of my company's employees, which is one of my kids, is currently reviewing it as we speak, and they're already ringing a nice long list, which is good, but this is the foundation. This is what we started doing, where we've got funding, we've got support, and we want content which is like world class at this point. And while it's a fairly basic game, it's showing you everything you need and everything you wanted, or maybe even didn't want to know, about how to build your project from MonoGame from the very beginning with just a blank machine, all the way to having your game ready and then publishing it to something like itch.io or Steam or some kind of trick. The case of it shows you everything you would need to know in between. And what I liked about your collaboration between yourself, Vic, and Chris is that it's also leaning on. There is a huge wealth in the MonoGame community for libraries, for plugins, for code and reusability. That's just, there is literally thousands of projects out there that you can use. It's unfortunately it's a bit like JavaScript. There are just 1,001 ways to do the same thing, but highlighting what those are, showcasing what they are, and the MonoGame team will do what they can to promote the best of the best that are out there. Gum is one of those. A lot of people are using NES and other projects out there, but the whole point is with MonoGame, it's a family. You're not just building a game on your own. You're building with everybody else because we're all committed to open source and building and making sure that projects are successful. They have all the tools they need to be successful, and also a helpful community always jumping in there to get things done. So, yes. So, community content creators like yourself, Vic, who are building these tools and have passion for making those tools the best they can be. Maybe build an engine, maybe no. Maybe we'll rebuild Flatbed Bull in C++ like some others like to do. Yeah, it's crazy. But we're here. The sounds like, I mean, Tom can talk to this. They run porting studios, and they're taking MonoGame games and putting them to all platforms. And there's other support mechanisms out there and ways to ensure the fact that you get the maximum reach for what your project can do. Some might cost money, like translation or for like porting houses and things like that. A lot of it's off the cuff, and while it's not mandatory, we'd highly recommend, if you're making money on your game and you're taking a benefit of all the tools and things, then make sure to think about giving back, whether it's code, whether it's cash, and everything else. So for this, we get to the end of the presentation and the team are all showing up. Thanks for joining, Tom. Okay, so as to questions, now this can be an interesting one, and Vic and Tom, I'm not sure you can be able to answer this. How compatible is Gum with things like Brute and other transpilers for getting to work on consoles, or have you done anything in this area or not?
I could say from my perspective, no, I haven't had to port a game that uses Gum. I mean, in general, it should be portable. If it uses, as long as you're using like the MonoGame APIs for content access and for shaders and for rendering, it should just work. I don't anticipate any problems there. The only thing that always gets a little sketchy is things that depend on reflection. But they're always solvable. It's just a matter of, telling the ahead of time compiler that, hey, we're using these things that, from our data, it's reading a data file to say, okay, create this type, as long as it knows ahead of time there's types you're creating, which is very easy to tell it, hey, just include all these Gum UI types. If it needs to do that, that's fairly straightforward to do. So there shouldn't be any problems. It should be portable.
Yeah, I'll just add to that real quick. So Gum, native AOT, I think there might be a few small problems with native AOT right now just because we're taking advantage of some reflection things that wouldn't be available there. But all of those things are totally optional, and we have it on our list right now to make a guide on the types of things you should and shouldn't do if you want to be native AOT compliant. I can't show a screenshot of this, unfortunately, but I have seen, I should say, images of Gum running on the Switch. So I do know that it works, and it's native AOT compliant, or at least it can be. And we're going to be doing a lot of work on that. We've already had a few people in the community ask about that, and that's going to be a big focus for us this summer. So yeah, we will make sure, if that's a concern for you, I give you my personal guarantee, we'll make sure that it works, and if there's any problems, we'll jump on those issues immediately.
Don't be answering questions and getting them unmuted in time. So yeah, I mean, it's like a lot of things in the community. It's all working together to get these things. I'll probably recommend, Vic, is that we've got the console check solution, which does a way to make sure the fact that compiling a project with that will also check to make sure the fact that you're not using any language variants that are not supported on some platforms which don't yet support it. Right, okay. Oh, look at this. Some people are summarizing questions for us to really throw them back in here. So, we had a comment earlier about where I was talking about DirectX, Tom, regarding to audio, which we've discussed. And while we're going to have a sort of an out-of-the-box audio solution, we're also going to provide guides for, I believe it's Fmod, is it? It's our sort of our stated recommended implementation.
Yeah, there's WYs and Fmod, which are, so yes. So the idea is that with out of the box with DX12 support on PC, we're going to support X Audio as the low-level audio solution. You'll still be able to use the exact path that we have. We might do some small improvements to our C# exact implementation, but we're really not going to focus on doing a lot of work there because exact is ancient. I don't know, it's almost 20 years old at this point, unsupported, not very, the tools are 20 years old. It's not very good solution. We recommend that if you want a higher level audio solution, that you aim at something like Fmod, which is totally reasonably priced for small studios and indies. It's basically free until you make a certain amount of money, and even for consoles. And then after that, you pay a royalty rate of some sort. I don't know, the details are on the Fmod site, but we're gonna provide some guidance on how to use something like Fmod or WYs to be able to add high level audio to your system beyond the basic sound effect instant stuff that's provided in MonoGame. So you could think of it as just like you're adding a third-party library on top that adds existing or more enhanced support for audio. And that's basically what Exact did. It was just built into XNA originally. And this is just the same thing, but just separate and just a better version of Exact, basically. So yeah, that's the plan that's the plan for the DirectX, and that X Audio implementation is used both on PC under Windows and also used on Xbox. So it's the same implementation on both. It works there, it works on those platforms. For the OpenGL desktop platform that is moving toward, it's not just OpenGL, the new native backend, it's Vulkan. On that platform, it's supposed to be cross-platform. It's supposed to work. We call it desktop because it works on desktop machines. It works on Mac. It works on Linux. It works on Windows. If you target that platform, it's going to use the OpenAL backend at the moment. There's some discussion on whether we should maybe support FNA or not, but it seems like we're leaning towards OpenAL at the moment, is just retaining that because it's compatible. It works. It's something we can use on all the other platforms. It allows us to use it on Windows, Mac, Linux, iOS, Android. It's the best solution, maybe not, but it's one that gives us the most compatibility and it works for core audio needs. But with all those platforms, you can also support Fmod. You can use WYs on all those platforms, so you can still use a higher level library. One thing you really can't do very well with these is mix Fmod with XNA, for the traditional MonoGame sound effects. Usually one sound system wants to be in charge. I think there's a way to kind of work around that, but in general, it's difficult. So usually if you start up Fmod, you usually don't want to use Microsoft Sound or the MonoGame sound system at the same time. And we avoid starting up the system until, you actually use it. But yeah, so it should be workable. So that's kind of the plan for audio at the moment, is that. And that's working now. So actually, we don't have a new OpenAL implementation for the Vulkan backend on native. That's high on our list of things to add here soon. But I know some work's happening right now to solve some issues on iOS with OpenAL.
Cross-platform is hard, especially at the native level. Okay, so There's a question here for you, Vic, for how does the editor relate to the project? Does it work on an existing project structure, or does it create its own work folder into game code?
The answer to that question, there's actually probably a half dozen answers to that question. But in the simplest scenario, the way that the editor works is when you work in the editor, you're creating what we call screens and components. And these are just XML files that you essentially copy from your content folder into your bin folder. And when you load up your project, all of those things are loaded up in there in context. Now, if you want to instantiate one of those objects, you just do so by its name. So that means you could create your own custom button fully in the editor, and then you would just grab the object by its name, like, quote, my button in editor or whatever, and then you just do dot, and then there's a to graphical UI element extension, and you just call that one function, and boom, you have a live object, just as if you instantiated it yourself in code. And then you can add that to a container, you can add it directly to the root, you can do whatever. Now, in a typical scenario, what you would actually do is you wouldn't just instantiate one component at a time. Instead, you would create an entire screen. Like, I want to make a main menu screen that has buttons, and I want to have a title up top and a copyright text at the bottom or whatever. Then you just instantiate that one screen, and it will recursively create everything for you, and there it is on your screen. Now, you can always grab references that you've loaded and then make modifications in code, or you can go the opposite direction, which is you can do a primary code first approach, but then bring in editor stuff as you want if you have a really complicated layout, or if someone has created a component that you just want to pull into your project, you can totally do that as well. And so there's really not like even though we recommend certain approaches and we have documentation for code only and editor only, they really can be merged in a half dozen ways to mix and match whatever functionality you want. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, good. Now, there's one other question for you there, Vic, which is about controller inputs. Can you bind certain controllers to certain UI elements for, say, multiplayer, local play scenarios?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for something like that, like, for example, like on Shredder's Revenge, right? You have different game pads for each player, and you're pushing left and right on one of them. What you would want to do in that situation is you'd probably want to handle the controls yourself anyway, right? Because we have built in for standard stuff, like I'm tabbing between buttons, I'm dropping over, drop downs or whatever. But something like a character select screen really isn't something that GUM offers out of the box because it's so customizable. So for something like that, every control has events that are raised anytime gamepad actions occur. So when you push the left or the right on the D-pad or the A, and that's where you would respond to those in your own code, and you can then check, okay, am I on controller index 2 or whatever. So I guess technically it depends on how you want to view that as a yes or no, but with events, you can find out who pushed what, and then you can respond to that. So I hope that answers it.
Yep, seems fair. I mean, as with anything else, as soon as the input starts to get interesting, then it's you need to do more work yourself, and that's true for any framework or platform and trying to break boundaries and things. We did have one question about the 3D bounty. Yes, the 3D bounty. We did have a bit of a hiccup. The original author wasn't able to continue with it, so we had to reopen it and we took on someone else. And the new author is a guy called, I'm going to butcher his name, he's French, I believe, is Gaetan. And he's working hard. He's done most of the chapters already. But I have to keep reminded, looking at Chris's tutorial and pointing out to where the bar is. But it's shaping up quite nice. We're making sure, again, where the 2D tutorial is focusing pure 2D. So, yes, you have 3D effects and things, but again, you're working on a single plane or parallax screens and things like that, but you're using 2D logic, you're not using cameras, you're just using orthographic effects and how things are working. When you transition to 3D, you have a little bit more to work with. You got to work with all the view and projection matrices. You got to work with basically you got 3 dimensions of access, of actually interfaces that you're already working through these things, and there is a lot more to take account for. But what we always recommend is that you get first a good firm standing in 2D. And I apologise if it gets really noisy here. Someone's rang the doorbell and there's someone at the door. I don't know why. Having a 2D understanding means you understand the graphics pipeline and you understand how drawing works, and how it all gets put together. When you then transition into 3D, you've got a lot of the familiar concepts ready, and it's just working with the 3D maths and matrices and all the funky stuff that comes from trying to work in 3 dimensions. I suppose that's an interesting thing, is that if I've got a 3D project, Vic, are there any complexities to be aware of when you're applying GUM in there? Or in fact, can GUM render within 3D space as opposed to just as a flat orthographic view?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll give you a few answers. The first answer is that if you're doing anything with GUM in a 3D space, you need to take the same precautions that you might take if you're using Sprite Batch in 3D, which is that Sprite Batch can mangle your draw states, your render states, and you have to preserve those or reset those when you're done. So typically what you would do with GUM is it would be drawing your UI or your HUD, so it might be sitting at the very end of your draw call, so that might not be as big of a concern, but of course you always have to reset your render states on the next loop. GUM can draw to a render target, and it supports it perfectly fine, and you can actually have, excuse me, a matrix that you can apply to GUM so that it knows how to translate your cursor, so that if you were to put GUM on some like little thing in the corner that you're using with render states, render targets, you can still click on it and everything will work just fine. And so if you're going to be doing everything in 3D, the easiest way, of course, is just to use a render target and then draw that on quads or on a model or whatever you want to do. As far as rendering individual objects in 3D, you can do that. It's a little bit harder to do. I didn't talk about it in this presentation, but there's this object called a GUM batch, which is very similar to Sprite Batch. The difference is that you can pass it any GUM object. It can be an entire screen. It could just be a single text object. And just like Sprite Batch, it supports a matrix that you can apply so that you can have all kinds of different effects. And by doing that, you could effectively draw in 3D space if you want. Of course, you have to manage your depth buffer read and writes as you would normally. So yeah, it can be done.
Sounds fun. It sounds like there's good experiment for tutorials there and other ways to do things. Just to, what I always like to see is the 3D character goblin walking through with the health bar that's been drawn by gun and just showing how those kind of different interactions work. We have had one question. Well, they've deleted it, but anyway, the status of Mac with the MDCBX. Yes, it's a known issue. There was a minor glitch that sort of made its way into the 3.8.3 code base, where it's to do with the actual file path of how it's actually launching it. So I still recommend using the old 3.8.1 or 1 or 2 release for the editor. But we're working on that, and that should be in the patch release that we do coming up, or at least be in the preview, so you can test. I highly recommend when we get that first preview out, everyone jump on that, because that helps us to help further test in the wild all the changes and things going in there. We've had another question around the Xbox PR. Now, I did cover this briefly, but as Tom's here now, you can give a more full explanation for the status where the Xbox PR is up to.
Oh, sure. Sorry, I was making sure I wasn't muted. Yeah, so there's a PRX up for Xbox right now that it's currently sharing the DirectX implementation with PC. We just need a couple people to look at it, and we're going to kind of just push it forward at this point. It replaces the previous one that was done as a bounty holder. We basically took the work that was done previously to add DX12 support on Xbox and leverage that to move it into the public repo, which there's been a DX12 PR that's been open for a little while. It's been reviewed. I think everything is solid there. We're just waiting because we're kind of working on a hotfix release. Once that gets done, we should be able to merge in that DirectX 12 implementation. And then once that's merged, then we can merge the Xbox PR. Again, because we're tying it to the Windows build, we have to share those two. So once that one's merged, then the Xbox PR can go in, and then we can, at that point, we're kind of done there for now. It's not done because there's still paths that are not implemented fully. But it's things like the 3D support or like 3D textures and volume textures, and I think there's one other thing that might not be implemented there that I noticed the other day. But it's a couple things like that. There's no music implementation at the moment, something we lost in the process of moving over to the new system, but the audio is there. So the music implementation needs to come from we're going to share it with the upstream repo, the music implementation that we want to do there. So that's something that's a work in progress. But otherwise, everything's kind of coming together there. I've since then started moving over to preparing PlayStation. So PlayStation work is in progress at the moment. which has its own complications. And there's a couple things that we're working on in the background to kind of combine with all this. I think there's a PR open for adding in a save game API to the high level to MonoGame. It's kind of restoring the old save game API from XNA, but enhancing it to better support all our platforms. That's something that we are kind of open to doing some sort of discussion. We have to do some internal discussion to make sure that everybody's on the same page. It's complicated because we need to make sure the save games work with one API on all platforms in a consistent way, so you can depend, if I write to this API, it's going to work everywhere and I don't need to think about it again. That's the goal. Just like if I want to render a sprite, it just should work and I shouldn't have to think about it again. It works on all platforms, same thing. We have to be able to do that. There's also some work on a better, some enhancements to the native API that were already done, like adding a way to access native files in a way that is efficient it's specifically coming up because of some issues with Android. But because of that, we're adding that to the native API so that we can actually use that also on console, where there's some extra APIs that we can potentially hook into to get faster disk access. But it also cleans up some APIs there. So there's a lot of stuff happening around the console space that is also being shared with the PC code. So a lot of complexity there tying it all together, but we're getting close. I really want to be done with this first pass at getting everything switched over to the new native backend, in the next month. So we can then we can go back and start hitting other features. Internally in our studio, we're working on a new port. That new port has some functionality that is necessary on one of the console platforms. It's not implemented. So whenever stuff like that happens, we're going to push that work back into the console platform so that everybody has access to it. But really, the next step here is on the foundation side is once these first set of builds or first pass at all these native implementations and all of them are in there, and we've purged the per platform copy of everything that we had before with the old system. Then we are kind of all unified and we can kind of push everything forward in the same direction with the new native backend on everything, and we can kind of finish out these systems that are not done. Music streaming is one of them that's always been a pain in the ass across all the platforms. They all had different implementations and it was tricky. That's going to be unified, mostly because music streaming is fairly easy. You don't need to have hardware platform specific code for doing that. Music is very low cost. You just have to have a good implementation. It streams a fixed open source format that's high quality and it just works. The next one is video, which is always a pain in the ass because unfortunately, video is very hard to process well in a shared way. There's a lot of proprietary formats that that we can't use. There's not a lot of open source libraries that we can depend on, and every platform has its own video backend that gives you some hardware support, but they're all independent. So that's the next hard one after that, to get kind of a complete, hey, we support video, we support music, we support all the audio, we support all the graphics, we support all the input, we support Windows, window handling and everything. Like at that point, everything is finally complete from that perspective on all the platforms. And then we can start, really pushing towards, well, how are we enhancing the API for the future? So that's kind of the short version of the long story of consoles getting there. So we should have if you're on the console stuff, you should be seeing some posts from me in the next week or so about the Xbox stuff being updated. And the previous Xbox stuff is still there for anybody that's currently working on stuff. We're not going to kill the old branches. We're going to tag everything so that it's available for people maintaining older code bases that are needing updates or whatever. And yeah, hopefully soon we can talk about Switch 2 stuff. Yeah, that's basically where we're at.
Okay, I'm going to apologise to our streaming folks for the fact that they've not actually heard me talking for the entire thing because my PC disconnected my microphone.
Oh, yeah.
So only Discord to hear. The video stream's going to have me just in silence. I suppose just to clarify as well, yeah, the work you're talking about with the file access, Tom, is the storage container PI, I believe.
Yeah, I believe that's what it is. I'll look it up real quick just to be sure. But yeah, there's a storage container. That's what it's called. Mm-mm. Yeah, the storage container classes is actually that's the save game stuff. That's just Microsoft's old terminology for what they called, save game data as storage container. It was used for different things, but the main use of it was save game stuff. And Dom had done some work and brought back that API. We originally had that API in the original version and was kind of halfway implemented on a lot of platforms to a certain extent, but all the implementations were different and had different rules. And it used an old style. When Microsoft wrote this was early C#, so it used like a weird async mechanism where you'd say begin and then called end and things like that in order to do stuff. It just was a bad old mechanism. At the time, that's the only way it worked. Now there's modern APIs to use it, and it doesn't need to be that complex. It's a lot simpler now because it just handles threading under the hood. So yeah, there's some work being done there, and myself and Tomas and some of the people are contributing to that to get a unified approach that takes advantage of our experience with porting games and what games need on these platforms, and trying to get an implementation that everybody can depend on. And hopefully no one will ever have to write any save game code ever again. You just write to this API and it just works. The only people that might have to is if you're doing something crazy like storing, 20 gigabytes of saved data for some reason, you're going to have trouble. But other than that, it should just work for everybody.
Yep, that's the aim. We're always aiming to be as cross-platform as possible, give you all the tools you need so that, we're, rather than the 80-20 rule, we're looking more at the 90-10 rule. So we're doing as much as we can up front so that there's very little you have to do across any other platforms. And we try to stay away from our own tagline, don't we, Tom? We do the best we can to make your game work in as many places as possible.
Yeah, the old tagline is horrible. It never was true. It'll never be true. So, yeah, the old tagline is horrible, but yeah, we're trying to make it give you as much as we can to make it as common as possible so that you can, implement stuff one time and not have to worry too much, but there'll always be platform differences.
Yep. There's one question here. Hopefully you can answer this, Tom. Will we remove the old OpenGL version in MonoGame, MonoGame 4, or?
Yeah, I mean, at some point we will, right? Like, it's still an open question, I guess. Like, is Vulkan, the real question is, can we use Vulkan everywhere? Does Vulkan everywhere plus DX12 and the proprietary APIs for certain platforms, does that cover everything? As soon as Vulkan can be kind of covered everywhere, then we're probably okay. Like, I don't know can we use Vulkan on every Android device out there? Or are we, can we not? Can we use Vulkan on some Raspberry Pis and stuff like that and not use OpenGL? We want to make sure that we have compatibility. We could add a new OpenGL implementation, a new modern OpenGL implementation written in the native API. That shouldn't be terribly difficult, so we can always add that. I think for now, we're keeping what's in there. It's just a question of when we purge that back end. Probably once the native implementation works across all our platforms, we can start talking about do we want to get rid of the OpenGL implementation? And if we do we want to replace it with a new one or not? Do we need it or not? We're still a small team. While we have a budget, it's still very limited. So we don't want to add too much work on ourselves if we don't have to. But yeah, I think that if you look at other engines, they're kind of depending on Vulkan and DX12 moving forward. I don't know how many people are actually targeting Metal at this point. They're just depending on, Vulkan on Metal kind of wrappers to handle that. So yeah, I'm not sure yet exactly, but it has been discussed internally.
As ever with these things, it's always a moving target. But we do have limited time, limited resources. We're doing everything you can with sort of the funding that the foundation has. And also, this is where we kind of rely on the community to help pitch in, direct which way the foundation should be going. We've got most of our ideas. We're using a lot of experience from working with different projects, working with live projects that are being published to consoles and other platforms. And we're always constantly asking ourselves, is there something we've learned from building and deploying these projects, and can we share that information in some fashion with the wider community? But the same goes for yourselves. Everyone who's out there now who's building games and shipping them, is there something you've learned and that you are a problem you faced? How big of a problem it is? Should the foundation help and get involved with that, or is it something the community themselves can actually just put forward and get out there? So we're a family at the end of the day. We're all helping each other out to make each other successful and use whichever tools and facilities we have available. So, okay, Tom, you just. I was going to say there's another question coming, but no, I think we.
No. I suppose yeah, that's the thing that Dean was working on. That is what I mentioned earlier, like a new API, and this is internal API for handling read-only content. File systems. People think it's a file system. You open a file, you read it, you write it, whatever. But there's a very especially on consoles or on devices, there's a very specific read-only file system that you can only read data from. When you ship a game, there's read-only data that is your game content, and then there's writing areas. On console, the writing areas are very specific. There's some little bit of temporary space you can write to, and then there's your save game data, and that's it. You can't just write to the area where your game data is written. And that, a lot of times when we port games, we see that problem where people just say, "Oh, just use file open to open this file," and the immediate problem is that if you don't specify it, it opens it with read and write flags, which fail on console immediately because it says, no, you can't write to this, so you can't open it with read and write flags. So whenever people make mistakes like that, we realize that we need these APIs to be able to do this. And things like Android, the problem there is that when you want the only way to access some of that Android data is through an API that is doesn't allow seeking, and you have to call a native API to get to these, or a special API to get to these file system calls. So we kind of had to have a new API to make it very clear we're trying to open a file in a read-only mode, not a read-write mode, and we didn't want to go through the C# file API that we can't really control as well, at the MonoGame level. So this is kind of a new API that's used internally to very clearly state, hey, we're reading a file, we're opening a file specifically to read it and not to write it, and that's what this API does, and kind of clarifies that, and then it allows us to hook into some APIs that are supposedly let you read and write files faster with things like priority access and stuff like that. There's special APIs there in some consoles. Microsoft, I think, posted their stuff sometime back called, what is it called? Direct disk or direct, what was it? I forgot what it is. It's direct something.
Direct drive, wasn't it? I believe it was.
Was it?
I think it's either direct drive or direct access is what.
Direct storage, maybe?
Direct things.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, direct storage is what they called it. Yeah, it was an API written around, it's funny, the Windows API has a huge legacy, I guess 30, 40 years legacy of the old file system APIs that has a lot of really old crusty code that somebody 20 years ago wrote for a specific case, that they can't remove because some people don't know how that works, and the people that do know how that works, are limited, and so it's all a lot of legacy code in there. So every time you open a file, there's a lot of legacy code in there, and they try to trim it down, but there's certain limits. So this direct storage API goes around that, saying, hey, we're talking to a modern system with, if you have an SSD and it's a certain configuration, we have some limits, we can talk to it very, very fast. So they wrote this API to be able to do that. For us to take advantage of that, we need to know that it is a file we can operate that way. So having our own internal API for specifically reading data that is read-only, we can then say, oh, we can hook into this and actually use APIs like this optionally, to get some better performance potentially. Will it be a huge advantage to a lot of MonoGame titles? Probably not. It might shave off a little bit of time in certain cases, or if you happen to be loading very large content, which is a very small percentage of MG titles would be doing stuff like that. But we're always looking at ways to keep our APIs very, allow us options to hook into optimal paths when we can, so that we have these options for the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the content pipeline. We built that so that you have you design your content one way, and then we transform it to work on whichever platform in the most efficient way possible for how that platform operates with that content. So, similar kind of patterns and processes. There we go. What I did like about the direct storage as well is that it's cross Xbox and PC. So they didn't mince things. It's a case of like you've got gaming on PC, you've got gaming on console, you gaming on cloud. It's the same way, and it's just having the cross-platform way to do that. So, we're 20 minutes over the hour again. One of these days we'll get to time, but I blame Vic.
Yeah.
He just talked forever, and and everyone wanted to ask questions, but it's good. So we might as well call this to a close. Another grateful session. And I suppose in this way, shape, form, thank you everyone for coming to our April meeting now. Granted, a week later than advertised. We do try to keep things but April's just pushed everything back. I blame April 1st. Everyone was too busy reading all the April 1st jokes that were going around. We were sensible. MonoGame doesn't hold party to April 1st, at least not this year. Although I do love reading those posts afterwards. I think I got caught out nearly by one, which was hilarious. But apart from that, we'll catch you all on the Discord, and we'll catch you all around on the issues and logs. As usual, any feedback or questions, drop in a feature request or chat with everyone on the MonoGame Discord. We're always around and listening as much as we can, and essentially we're a community, so everyone be nice to each other and jump in. And thanks for coming along, Vic, showing us more of your gum wares and your gum code. And I've not really got much code in these gums, but I'm sure the work just as well. But hey ho. So I'll do the entire session without doing that. I'm a dad. I'm allowed to do dad jokes. I'm sorry. Right. So we'll call this to a close. Thanks to everyone. This has been your MonoGame session for the year. And I can't even. Discord is just there. We are. Discord is blowing up in my face now. There we go. Thanks to everyone, and we shall catch you all next month.
All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.